Now do you think it'll work?
Morning, Mr. Trask.
Good morning.
Somebody swiped our coal chute right off the wagon.
Dear, times are getting pretty lawless. It's this war in Europe. There's a wave of lawlessness spreading through the country.
Well, anyway, somebody swiped our chute.
Is that where you're loading?
Yeah.
We'll move on then. Good day, Mr. Trask.
It's this war in Europe.
You want them good?
Oh, sure, lots of water.
Not too much, though.
Oh, no, just right.
Marty Hop's got a telegram today. His boy was killed.
I remember the day we sent him off.
Of troop ships have been sunk. They don't even tell us about.
It's gonna be a long war.
Those Germans got an army.
They're a military nation.
Go back where you came from, German! Go on home, German!
Been wondering lately we should...
Ain't this some... Boy, some beans.
You come here every day, boy! What do you think? You gonna make him grow quicker?
He's crazy.
I suppose you can hear the noise that's going on in the background here, and there is lots of it. And now on our camera with us, we're very proud and happy to have Mr. John Steinbeck, the author of this wonderful picture that's premiering here tonight. John, I suppose you're excited.
Yes, I'm excited.
Are you always excited?
I'm excited even by openings that aren't my own.
Well, I know what you mean exactly. There's something very romantic about an opening, isn't there?
Something very terrifying, too.
Yes, but I think with real talent, I don't think it's quite as terrifying as it is romantic, because it's leading perhaps to something even greater in their career. And who can tell but that this picture may be a great stepping stone for some of the wonderful talent in it.
I think that's nonsense. I think the real tragedy would be if you had an opening without talent.
Oh,
Tonight we have talent.
We have talent. We have both, so we'll be very thankful. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Welcome, everyone, to HSU Library. My name is Sorello Belander. I'm the Dean of the Library, and I'm very happy to have all of you here and to welcome Tom Gage, our HSU Emeritus Professor and Fulbright Scholar. He is a prolific author and recently authored American Prometheus, Carnegie's Captain Bill Jones, published by HSU Press, and today he's here to help us celebrate John Steinbeck's birthday in a very interesting way, and to draw our attention to the value of our research and how it helps us discover the connections hidden in the visible texts we read. Please welcome Tom, and thanks to everyone for celebrating authors John Steinbeck and Tom Gage.
Thank you very much for weathering the weather and joining us this afternoon. I want to point out a couple of things from the video, the motion picture of East of Eden, as several tessera that join the four that you're looking at right now, because what I plan to do is to bring them all together into a coherent package. You might note that in the film, I cropped out that passage having to do with lettuce getting onto the ice train to go south. That's then followed by the scene of people marching off to war, the tenants, the farmers, and then the bigotry against the German, and then finally James Dean with the beans, growing up the beans. These four link to the picture of John Steinbeck. Right next to it is my uncle and aunt. My uncle, Dan Gage, dated John's cousin, Dorothy Hamilton, when they were in the 10th grade. There's Carnegie, as you will likely recognize. And these are awards I won at the New York City Book Expo in 2013 for the work that has been parlaying into what Humboldt State published. And then this is the Cradle of Civilization, which I'll be touching on. I want to thank Sorrel Oberlander and Kyle, Morgan, Kumi, Watanabe Stock, who have been so supportive in my efforts. It's been just a joy to conclude my career at over 30 years teaching here, and then to have the support and encouragement of these. And I want to thank my friend Tim Martin, who is working with me right now on this particular project, The Cradle of Civilization. And I want to particularly thank my wife, who in 1994, when we were at a National Council of Teachers of English meeting, we wound up looking at 1889 newspaper reports of the death of Captain Bill Jones, my great-grandfather. And that is what I really will be centering on. While we're working on this book, I realized that something that I had heard about from my mom and my uncle, Uncle Dan, linked Steinbeck with the family, and it was more than that because I have this letter which I'm giving today to the library, a letter that John Steinbeck wrote to my dad in 1936. This letter will center on really what I'll be getting to. But when I started researching the papers of my deceased father, my deceased uncle, my deceased brother, I realized there's an incredible story here. And I wrote an article, and it's the article that should appear right here. I submitted it to the Steinbeck Review. It was refereed, then published, and within a year, a professor at the University of Chicago got in touch with me and said, Tom, I am assembling essays on John Steinbeck's East of Eden, which will be published in the 60th anniversary of the book coming out, and that is this. And he said, I would like your chapter that was in Steinbeck Review to be chapter 1. So this was a great joy and honor, and but it led essentially out of the writing of the book that I was involved with Lena Caro, who was my editor here, and I want to thank you especially. I'm sorry, I didn't know a second ago, but that wound up with this book coming out. And James Gash, and some of you may know, took this picture in Arcata about a year and a half ago. The story is this. For those of you who have not read East of Eden, or those who've seen only the movie, or have not read the novel, let me give you a kind of structure of it, because it bears on really what my article is about. You have the two families. You have the Steinbeck maternal family of the Hamiltons. Samuel Hamilton was the patriarch who died in 1904, 2 years after John Steinbeck was born on this date. And in the novel, Steinbeck has Samuel live on until 1911. And when you look at the novel, especially the first half, you have the story of Samuel Hamilton, his oldest son, George, Will, and Tom. And then you get to what is covered in the film, the second and third generations of the Hamilton family. Now, what I discovered, this is something my father didn't know, my uncle did not know, my mother didn't know, was that the Trask family, the other family, the non-fiction family, is my great-grandfather and my dad and his father. And that's what I want to walk you through today. The interesting thing that what Steinbeck was structuring in the novel is here you have Samuel Hamilton, an inventor who had patented a number of things but never made any money with it. And on the other hand, you had Captain Trask, who is an avatar of my great-grandfather, who had more patents for iron and steel than anybody in the 19th century, anywhere. And so what Steinbeck is looking at is fortunes in the Salinas Valley, east of Eden. And I want to have us sort of think about what Steinbeck was going on in his mind. He wrote this in 1952 after a very rough decade before, when, in fact, John was divorced by his wife, Gwen Conger, who bore him 2 children, 2 sons, and she took off. He was married to Carol Hemmings in the 30s, who was a brilliant, wonderful woman who had edited much of his great work. And John then met, after having success with East of Eden and Grapes of Wrath, he was hanging around with Burgess Meredith and Charlie Chaplin, and he met this woman who was a singer in a nightclub in LA, and he took off with her. That ended his first marriage. She left him, and he is writing this book at a time when he is very much down. He's just met his 3rd wife, Elaine Taylor, who was Zachary Taylor's ex-wife in Hollywood. But what I want to point out here is what was in Steinbeck's mind. There are some things here which Steinbeck reveals to us about his mind in 1934. He's written this letter to another friend, George Albee, and he's saying this about himself: overalls and carrots do not make me unhappy. But the thing which probably more than anything else makes me what I am is an imperviousness to ridicule. In fact, as an organism, I am so simple that I want to be comfortable, and comfort consists of a place to sleep, dry and fairly soft, lack of hunger, almost any kind of food, occasionally a loss of semen in intercourse when it becomes troublesome, and a good deal of work. Now, this is Steinbeck. He is recording his sense of being a mere protoplasm in life. He is just on the edge of publishing a couple of his great books. At this time, or about 2 years later, he writes a story called Johnny Bear. And Johnny Bear is a kind of WikiLeaks. In the case of Johnny Bear, a short story, Steinbeck has created this mentally retarded figure whose only language is one word: whiskey. But he has a minor bird capacity to imitate voices he hears as he crawls around underneath people's bedroom windows. And he comes into Fat Carl's bar in Loma, which is probably, it's called Loma in the short story. I think it's Fields Landing. And he will say whiskey, and everybody becomes attuned, because they know that an awful lot of people are going to be guffawing after he reveals to some poor sap in the bar of what he heard underneath that person's window the night before. So it's a WikiLeaks, you see. But he can imitate these different voices really incredibly, and he gets his whiskey. That's just part of the story. Well, here you have Johnny Bear as a kind of an avatar of John Steinbeck from that letter to George that I just showed you. So he's looking at himself as a person who is simply recording what he's taking in as a writer. What's interesting about this, I think, is when we come to East of Eden, we find a big shift. He is no longer showing, he is telling. And it's with that shift, both geographically out of the west and into the east, that we find Steinbeck's writing somewhat waning from what it was. And he never really did write the literature that he wrote in the 30s. Steinbeck wanted to let everybody know about his grandfather, Samuel Hamilton, who I mentioned a moment ago, the patriarch of this pillar of Salinas Valley, with his sons and daughters. One daughter is Olive, John's mother. Now, we get back to Gwen, and what we're looking at is Gwen Conger had just left John with the 2 sons, and she really drove the sons against John. And so John was moved to write this novel, and I went to the University of Texas, where the Harry Ransom library is. It has It has everything. It has lace manuscripts. It has incredible work there. And I read John Steinbeck's original novel, 14.5 inches, a long paper. And John's handwriting is terrible, as you can see in this letter to my dad in 36. But what I found that does not occur in the journey of the novel, which is Pablo Cavici, his editor, and John's explanation of how he wrote this novel and provided me with a great deal of information. What is not covered there, if you go to the Harry Ransom Center, you'll see that Chapter 1, Chapter 3, Chapter 5, Chapter 7 is devoted to Tom, dear Tom, and then he starts the chapter to tell about Tom's family, because Tom and John and Gwen are long gone. And the other even number of chapters are to John, Tom and John. Pablo Cavici said, this isn't going to work. This is not an epistolary novel, so we're going to get rid of those introductions, I gather, because they're not in the book. Now, what's interesting here is that he is telling, in an epistolary fashion, the sons of this family that they come from and they no longer will know about. Now, here's where my family comes in. The oldest son is George. And he left Salinas. He left Salinas and came down to Paso Robles. And he had a kind of drugstore, sweet shop. We don't have them anymore, but you get your root beer floats. And kids would sort of hang around after school at this place. And my uncle, my dad, John's cousin Dorothy, and older cousin Patrick hung out there. So every holiday, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Christmas, John would come down and see the older Uncle George. And in the 10th grade, my dad and Uncle Dan and Dorothy were in the same class. To make a long story short, my dad had had a very bad accident as a young boy, at 5 or 6, and it banged him up pretty badly, and he was put back in school. So he went through school almost as if Uncle Dan and Dad were twins. Now, they went on to Stanford together, all three of them. My dad was the editor of the Daily Stanford newspaper and would publish John. I'll show you some correspondence between John and my father when John got the Nobel Prize, and some correspondence from Elaine when John died. My dad and my younger brother John, I never met John, but my younger brother did several times, he's a half-brother of mine, and John and Dad saw John Steinbeck and Elaine in May of 1968, and John died in the following December. So let's go back to Paso Robles, though, because it's in this milieu of Paso Robles that I began to see how this whole story takes shape. The governor of California was my grandfather's cousin. This is Henry T. Gage. This picture is in Sacramento. And Henry was the governor, and I can somewhat envision what happened in Paso Robles when the governor's cousin is coming to town to settle. And they were coming to Paso Robles because of World War I. We go back to the film and saw the people marching off to the front. The tenant of our nearly 400-acre ranch farm had gone off to the front in 1914. That left my uncle, my grandfather, the two kids, my grandmother, to come to Paso Robles and go to school, and they worked the farm because there was nobody else to labor. I'll come back to that in a second. I think what you have to imagine is that Governor Gage was an interesting guy. He's the one who started the public works in California. And he had written a letter that I have that's in my book that Humboldt University Press published, that he wrote my grandfather, Daniel Dudley Gage, and he said, Dan, you know, your family kind of got ripped off. Not in those terms, But he said, you know, I'm sending you a clipping, and I have that clipping, of a decision in the Third Circuit Court in the East where Carnegie made nearly $700,000 from but one of the inventions, the cradle of civilization I handed to him. That one invention got Carnegie nearly $700,000. It was then that all of a sudden my family, as you might say, smelled a rat. Now it's interesting too because my grandmother, Cora, and John's mother were born the same year, and I've reflected on that. I gave a talk in Pittsburgh last June about, not this, but about the book. And I thought, you know, God, that 1867, I talked to my grandmother when I was 4 years old. That voice broke the earth in 1867, 4 years before there was an Italy, 4 years before there was a nation of Germany. And I've never gotten over that. In fact, my grandmother's voice set me on a number of different projects that you're hearing about. Here is, in fact, a letter. There is my great-grandfather, a painting that I'm putting in my will that will go to Humboldt State. And I think the important thing was that in Paso Robles, during that period, the word was not only is the ex-governor's cousin coming to town, but this Cora, was she something? And she was. My second oldest memory was the night of December 7th, 1941. What happened then? Pearl Harbor. She wrote this letter the day after she called us. She said, Tommy, are you a good boy? You're taking care of your mother. Your great-grandfather built the Edgar Thompson Steelworks, and he put a baseball diamond right in the entrance. And I could still hear her as I heard Anita just before I left to come here today. She was a powerhouse. She, you know, so much has been forgotten in this history, but I want to call attention to three people who played a big role. Everybody in Paso Robles knew of them at the time, just as we know of Steve Jobs and Jonathan Rosenberg and Schmitz and Bezos. But these three people, the bust is of Alexander Hawley. And that's what you see as you enter Washington Square in New York City, right there. And Alexander Hawley was a brilliant guy who negotiated the Bessemer patent for all of the 11 steel works in the cartel in the United States. John Potter is up here in the corner. John Potter was superintendent of the Homestead Works, where the Tsar's Navy was built. Potemkin of Eisenstein fame was built in Homestead, Pennsylvania, when John was superintendent. Unfortunately, he was superintendent when they had the great shootout in 1892, the biggest strike and bloodiest affair in labor history in the United States. 14 people, 16 people were killed, and John took the fall. It was a situation where Carnegie and Frick had got 300 Pinkertons to come down and break up the strike at Homestead. He took the fall, he disappeared off the face of the earth, and then he reappeared, and I'll get to that. At the bottom there is Charles Schwab. Now, Charles Schwab was a protege of, both of these two guys were proteges of Captain Jones, but he followed Jones after Jones was killed as head of ET. He eventually became the founder with J.P. Morgan of the first billion-dollar industry in world history, U.S. Steel. And then, as often happened, Carnegie betrayed him. And he went off and he became president of Bethlehem Steel. And he became the richest man in the world. Now, what have these to do with my grandmother who called me the night of Pearl Harbor? Alexander Hawley was her godfather. Charlie Schwab was her piano teacher for 5 years. My great-grandfather hired this kid and said, I'll give you a job working at ET for $1 a day as a surveyor if you teach my daughter Cora piano. Yeah. And then he goes on to be the richest man in the world. He called upon my grandmother in 1925, which I'm getting to. John Potter had disappeared off the edge of the earth, returned to Los Angeles, ran into my grandfather. They started talking over coffee and realized, you know, our kids have all gone off, graduated from college, gotten married. They're not around anymore. So Gages, would you please move in? It'd be an honor for the captain's daughter to be living with me. So when my grandmother came back from Paso Robles with the kids and my grandfather, they became part of the John Potter house. Now, this is all well and good, but it's in the past. Things have been forgotten, or have they? This is not in my essay in the book, because last June, Anita and I were in Pittsburgh, and I gave a presentation, and about 3 weeks later, I get a snail mail letter from this person who is saying, I have your book, I'm enjoying it, I'm writing a play, and it's going to be performed in Pittsburgh 2020, and your grandfather is a major character in it. Sir Mark Rylance, the Oscar winner of 2015 in Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. So, I want to tell you, my wife can tell you, the pump house at Homestead, Wendell, that's where I was giving that talk. It was packed with 120 people. Steel and iron are big there. Here, fir and redwood. But you know, back east, Jones is still big. So here's my uncle again, and he dated Dorothy very briefly, but here's my grandmother. And she was really a formidable figure. As I said, this is the second oldest memory I have of talking with her. My oldest memory was of an orphanage. My oldest memory was with the Veit home on Grand Avenue, where I went to kindergarten at Lakeview Grammar School, just down the street. My mom had to park me there. My dad had deserted us. He didn't come home one night, and he couldn't come home thereafter. So he took off, and my mom didn't believe in alimony, and she simply toughed it out. In other words, Cora was calling that night of December 7th, pleading, please, Alice, you and Bill and Tommy, come on down and live with us, because you're working at Carnation Milk 7 blocks from the Oakland Mole, where troop trains will soon be coming out with ordnance and tanks and jeeps, kids from Alabama to Maine, and it's not going to be safe. And I can remember looking out the window at night, and you'd see these white pencils in the sky. It was a very tense period. We had something to worry about. Dad and John went on to Stanford, as I mentioned. My dad and my mom were married at Stanford. And all throughout Dad's life, he, with his brother Dan, you know, they both wondered what the devil would have happened if we wound up with the money that we had. That should have come our way. Well, let's go back to the earlier period, to this period. This is the letter that John wrote right there to my dad. And he's saying, in essence, I can't do what you want me to do, which is to write a book about your grandfather, Captain Bill Jones. I'm in the middle of a book having to do with farm workers, and I don't know when I'll be clear. John says, actually, according to David Demarest at the English department at Carnegie Mellon, he said, in this letter, Steinbeck goes on, after saying, I'm not going to be able to do it now, to write about the flanks theory, one of that rather interesting concepts that surfaced during Steinbeck's writing in the 30s. It appears in Dubious Battle, Grapes of Wrath, and Demarest argues that this letter has probably the best articulation from Steinbeck about what the flanks constituted. So what did my dad have in mind asking John to write this letter? Well, if we read this book, he had a copy and a manuscript. My dad had the manuscript and a copy of what my grandfather did write. And John Steinbeck got the carbon copy. And that's what he said, that's what he's saying I have, and I can't get to it. Elsewhere in the journey of the novel, he makes a remark, you know, I've been wanting to write about East of Eden and the Salinas Valley for the last 15, 17 years, but I just haven't had a chance. I've been off to Russia, writing the Russian journal. Now I'm going to write that darn story for my kids. I have 2 sons. But Dad wanted the story of Captain Jones because Jones was a Civil War hero. He was a hero of the Johnstown flood, the flood caused by a human error, the killing of most Americans until 9/11. And he was also the steel genius that everybody realized was the one who made Carnegie. The only plant that Carnegie had made was E.T. that Jones made. He bought others that had labor problems, but that was the one that was his pride. So what Dad had in mind was basically what I had in mind in writing this book that then led me to the article that's chapter 1 in that book. Now I want to kind of just touch on a couple of things about the correspondence between Dad and John that'll lead me now into the parallels between the novel's fictional character and the non-fictional characters. This is Dad's letter to John on winning the Nobel Prize. John responds thanking him for the recognition. When John died, this is Elaine's letter to Dad about how much the two meant to one another. This is a letter that in 1971 my dad wrote to my brother when he gave my brother this book, Steinbeck's The Short Reign of Pippin IV. I don't know if anybody's ever read. Dad in the letter tells my brother this book probably came about because Elaine and John, around 54, were going to France. They'd never been to France before. And my dad went back east and he worked for George Marshall, of the Marshall Plan. And he started what is now called AID. And his first job was working in France. He didn't like the French. And Steinbeck, 2 or 3 years after John and my dad drank gin and ate crab for 2 days straight, wrote that book. And so Dad was claiming I was responsible for that book. He did not realize how much of an influence our family as a whole bore on John, and I'm saying that's what I discovered, and that's what's in chapter 1 of that collection. So let's go back to the novel for a second and look at it. In the novel itself, you have the first half is about the Hamiltons and Captain Trask. And Captain Trask is in the East Coast. And he has 2 sons. And Samuel Hamilton has all of these sons, Tom, Will, George, and John's mother. And so that's what takes place in the first half of the book. What you saw in the clip in the film, that's really only addressing the last half of the book. That's why perhaps it may seem tenuous, my claims. But the Trask family arrives in California with wealth and prestige. And Adam Trask, who's very much like my grandfather, has 2 sons, Caleb and Aaron. The figure of Trask and my grandfather are entirely different, just as Kathy. Kathy, by the way, is Gwen Unger, John's ex-wife, not my grandmother. So let's walk our way through some parallels. Captain John Jones, the nonfiction historical figure, and Captain Trask, the fictional figure, both enters in the novel the Civil War first tour of duty in 1872. It is during that 9-month period that both are wounded. Now, in the second tour of duty, the captain, my great-grandfather got the captaincy in the second tour of duty, which was in 64-5, and he was the provost of Baltimore. Baltimore was that linkage between the North and Washington, D.C., pretty isolated in the South. He was there when Lincoln was assassinated. And the two, fictional and non-fictional characters, play a role. Both of them become very active in the Grand Army of the Republic. And my great-grandfather built a monument very similar to the Washington Monument in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Now, in the novel, Trask's wife commits suicide. In fact, my great-grandmother had something like multiple sclerosis and suffered with insanity for 2 decades. Now, what's curious here is that both of these two patriarchs, not Samuel Hamilton, but Trask and Jones, essentially provided a considerable wealth to their offspring. And in the case of Trask, it was through guile, the theft of money, embezzling the Veterans Association. In the case of the Jones Gages, being the subject of theft. So if we look at the two families, the nonfiction and fictional families, we see that each family had 2 offspring, and in each case, one with their family came to California to settle in. In the novel, Steinbeck identifies the Trask family of having $100,000. I have records of 1904 when the family had arrived a year before with $128,000. You got to understand, I had 10 addresses in Oakland because my mother and I were trying to keep ahead of the raising rent, and I keep hearing these stories, and I wasn't too sure just exactly if my mother really was all with it at times. But she was a autodidact who really had an incredible will and an intellectual thirst, which I think accounts for whatever I wound up doing. The governor's new letter and visit to the house in Riverside was what alerted the family to the fact that they had been victimized. And in the case of the novel, the Trask family learns about it when they're in California. Adam's brother, Charles, comes and tells him. So we have these very interesting parallels, and the parallels continue. When Adam is in the novel, he's in agriculture. He has the 2 sons. Caleb, he's rough and tumble. In the case of the other son, Aaron, he's bookish. He's the good one that we see in the novel, who in fact is a kind of Cain and Abel story. That son goes off and probably is killed in the war. So here is my dad's, the only picture ever taken of my dad's 3 sons. This is when I was living in Berkeley, where I was going to school and teaching. So what did my dad have in mind? I repeat this question. His father had written a biography. That biography had, in 1907 or 8, convinced my grandfather and Cora that if they met with Carnegie, they could go over the books and say, you know, the $35,000 that we got from you doesn't sound like what we should have gotten according to my cousin the governor. They went back to the Del Monte Hotel in New York City, met with Carnegie, and Carnegie said, well, they greeted him very graciously. You know, he was, he was a very gracious guy, and he said, you know, would you, Daniel, like to come to dinner at the Carnegie Veterans Association? next Friday, and my grandfather said, well, yeah. He shows him the manuscript. He looks at it and he says, well, I want to take this. I have a ghostwriter who can really kind of clean up the grammar. And my grandfather said, no. He grabbed it, took it back, and before they left, my grandfather was uninvited from the dinner with the Carnegie veterans the following Friday. They came back to California, and he worked more on the manuscript, and so he had these two copies. He had the manuscript and the carbon copy that John Steinbeck got, that John is reflecting on in this letter. Charles Schwab, on the other hand, had come out from the East, met with my grandmother. They were dear friends, and my grandmother said, well, you know, you'll write this story, because actually Schwab had promised several interesting people, this is all in my book, that he would see to it that the Captain Jones story would live. And so Charlie got the manuscript, and that has been lost. The Steinbeck copy is lost. I talked to Elaine Steinbeck in 1994 or 5 because I had this letter, and I thought, well, nobody seems to have had it. My mom read it, the manuscript. My Uncle Dan read it, my dad read it, and I was hearing all these stories, and yet, where's the book? Charlie Schwab took it back with him, and his biography, Whipple, in the notes that are in the Hagley Museum in Delaware, he states, I've seen the Captain Jones manuscript, and it's 50,000 words. It's 110 words. So this is a lengthy work, well underway. Incidentally, here is a handwritten penciled note written by Andrew Carnegie to my grandfather that I own. When my dad was sitting in Carnegie's lap with his broken leg, and on the occasion when grandfather was trying to get his attention to reconsider how much of the value the patents were. There were 50 patents, more than anybody. So this is the letter from Carnegie that I've translated. And as I said, my dad and my uncle continue to write back and forth about, well, what if? Well, frankly, I couldn't be happier. I wound up with what I have because I got this darn book finished. So there's a sort of palimpsest, you know, the palimpsest before there was inexpensive paper. You would have vellum animal skins, and very, very valuable. The library at Carcassonne, if you ever go there, has a ring in the ceiling where you would hoist up your books when you finished reading because they were terrific rat food. So palimpsests were very, very expensive. I would write on palimpsests to Sorel. Sorel would read it, and that's kind of interesting, but I needed a piece of paper, so he'd bleach my writing out and he'd send it to Tim. The same parchment with a different message. So this metaphor of the palimpsest I find fascinating, because there was first a grandfather's story, then there was Steinbeck's East of Eden, which was a refraction of the Captain Jones story, and then what Humboldt's State, Kyle and Sorel and Lena was published a year and a half ago. And I would like to sort of wind up with a thematically appropriate poem by Josephine Miles at Berkeley. When you swim in the surf off Seal Rocks, and your family sits in the sand eating potato salad, and the undertow comes and takes you out away from play, and the power of play hollers say, help, help, help! Hello, they will say, come back here for some potato salad. It is then that a 17-year-old cub cruising in a helicopter from Antigua, a jack straw expert, speaking only Swedish and as remote from this area as a camel, says, look down there, there is someone drowning, and it is you. And you say, yes, help, 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 and he throws you a line. That is what is called the brotherhood of man. be delighted to answer any questions. If you wanted to take a break and come back, I have a couple of copies of my book if anybody's interested. You'll get it all for free because it's online. And but if you wanted a signed copy, I have a couple of different people who are interested. Any questions about this history?
The palimpsest, as you know, I study landscape. So I'm kind of interested in different landscapes. You think you're telling kind of on the time scale.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the different geographies here? There's out east and out west, and it seems like the family story was an eastern story, but Steinbeck says it's west. Can you talk about?
Sure. Yeah, it's a very good question because the title is East of Eden. It's not Eden, it's East of Eden.
Right.
And that whole idea of Salinas Valley having sometimes winters where it's like the winter now that we're suffering from, that go on and on. You plant your crops. And what's really key here, going back to the film that you saw at the beginning, is remember you have Adam Trask. He has grown lettuce, and he is trying to put the lettuce onto the ice train to take it down to LA. That was the produce. Now the point here is that, remember in that little bit of the film, the German has his window broken because of the bias and anti-German feeling. The point is that the fictional Adam Trask was anti-war. And Steinbeck obviously is writing the novel that way because he's Steinbeck. And this was going on when he was right there with his cousins in Paso Robles, the anti-German feeling. Now, in the novel, what happens is, the question is, you really want to grow lettuce when there's a war going on? You could grow barley, you could grow beans, and you'd make a killing. And Adam, in the novel, says, I don't do war. And so he's growing lettuce for the population in the South. Now, my family had that same choice. And Cora and Dee Dee had been in Europe after they were married in 96. My great-grandfather had celiac disease or Crohn's disease, and they had gone to Europe to visit spas because Dee Dee wasn't expected to live. They were there in 1899 when the Spanish-American War broke out, and that war caused an incredible amount of anti-Americanism in Europe because it was a phony war. Remember the Maine. It was a Hearst creation, one of our carousels of wars. And so my family was very anti-war. And when the issue came, well, what will we grow on 400 acres? Almonds, not barley. So that very same choice that's in the novel is a part of my family history. But I think that the issue of East of Eden is key. Here, Easterners with money come out to what the Chinese call Gold Mine Mountain, California. And they got here, and it ain't so gold. You have forest fires, and you have horrible rains and washouts. This is the land of East of Eden, really not Eden. And Steinbeck is telling the story of the Bible, of Cain and Abel, especially as it appears in the film. And so you have that. Did I answer your question? Yeah. In a way, I kind of circled with you. I'm not too sure when I say finish saying. Really? Any other questions? John,
did you have much contact with your father when you were growing up?
First time I ever met him was when I was 20, and I hitchhiked from Berkeley to Damascus, and I stopped off to say hello. My brother had run away when he was 15, and he lived with my dad for a year, and that was unpleasant. I saw him maybe 10 other times for the rest of my life, when that picture was taken on the deck of my home in Berkeley. But no, you see so much of this story. I knew everything about Captain Jones. My mom and Cora were so close. So my mom had a silver brush with a pearl, not a pearl, but a kind of elephant tusk, in ivory. And she had rings, and in my house I still have a number of the things that come down from Captain Jones that Cora gave to my mom because she really was angry with her son and mistreatment. My mother would not accept a dime for alimony. She didn't believe in it. She said, I'll get a job as a secretary. Her sister, where my mom was. But no, the end of his life, he came out to California and died really soon after he landed. My uncle was a professor at Sac State in CSU, then with University of Oregon. And so it's all sort of in the family. And my daughter is a professor at Cal State Monterey Bay. No, I didn't know this story. When we were sharing an office for a decade or more, and you know I was working on this book, I didn't know what I'm sharing today. It was only when I got to a certain point about 2009, and I thought, I've got to go back to that pile of stuff that my brother Bill, my uncle, my dad, it just sort of by gravity reached me finally. And I said, I got to read that stuff. But it was just about the time after I retired.
How did you get your dad's letters?
He gave me this letter. And these other letters Uncle Dan had, and Bill had the letter that I showed you folded up inside this book, and then he died in '82, and I got this book from my sister-in-law. The book that I wrote, American Prometheus, has a lot more. It has the letter from the governor to Uncle Dan and Cora in Paso Robles, town that my dad and uncle were born in, and a lot of other correspondence I still have that is in either this article or that book.
The other correspondence is kept in other facilities or museums or?
No, I have a home. In my top level of my closet.
Place for it.
It's a terrible place for it. Yeah.
I know.
We've been having discussions about that.
They have safe deposit boxes at Coast Central. You could.
Yes.
Questions?
Do you have any ideas about what happened to Schwab's copy of the manuscript?
No, I don't. See, he was at Bethlehem, and then in a crash, he lost everything. He died with $300,000 in debt. And everything either went to Lehigh or went to the Hagley Museum. The Hagley Museum is, the director of it is Philip Scranton, and he wrote a very nice article, Appreciation Tom Gage's Captain Jones and Appreciation. That was in a journal following an essay that I'd written earlier in Pittsburgh history. Scranton was the one who provided me with the Whipple papers, where Whipple says, yeah, this manuscript about Jones is 50,000 words. Lehigh, I got in touch with a guy there, and he said that almost everything out of Lehigh is gone now down to Hagley. That's the one place I did not go, but I think the guy I talked to has a reputation of being a scrupulous scholar and archivist, so I just took his word for it. But it's amazing, when you start nosing around, all of a sudden the kinds of things that you find, and that's one of the things I find. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, and come on here and take a look at
And don't forget, we have 500,000 books for you to read in the future.